Welcome everyone to an issue of a Panzer Corps Dev Diary, Panzer Corps 2. Now, you might be used to me, of course, looking over Heartsfire and the diaries, but I've actually been told that Panzer Corps 2, which we'll be talking about just in a second, is releasing Dev Diaries now. And this is kind of interesting because Panzer Corps 2 is a game that I was kind of waiting for. However, there wasn't really that much information being released lately. It is apparently going to be releasing in somewhere in 2018, so now they're actually starting to get some information out, and yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and look over it. Now, what is Panzer Corps 2? In case you do not know, Panzer Corps is a series that essentially is a series of war games, so where you command, units in a tactical kind of setting, with an overhead map and hexes in this kind of way, kind of like Civ with more complex, you can say, combat mechanics. And then you have, of course, depending on what kind of war game, if it's a World War II war game, or if it's, I don't know, 30 Years War game or whatever, you're going to have, of course, different mechanics. But the gist is, you command units, you set, your military strategy, but you don't really pay that much attention about things like economy, supply, and what have you. You're just there to fight. And so that's what Panzer Corps is. This is the Panzer Corps 1, this image right here, and this is going to be the upcoming Panzer Corps 2, which is going to be the sequel, and they're both inspired by Panzer General. Of course, this dev diary, they're focusing on telling us what their sort of overall mission and project is, what their overall development strategy is, and so it's kind of interesting to outline what kind of game this is going to be. So they're saying that it's a spiritual sequel to the classic Panzer General series, just like Panzer Corps 1. And they want to preserve the traditions of that series that made it great. So what are these traditions? It is, as I said, kind of a well-developed tactical and rewarding combat system with many different units from World War II, all having their own unique roles to play. So, for example, you have a lot of different kinds of a single type of unit. So you're going to have a lot of different types of anti-tank guns. You're going to have a lot of different types of medium tanks, and then they're all going to have their own unique roles. Of course, that's what kind of you'd expect, but the way that sort of makes this war game unique from the other ones, and Panzer Corps took from that, is the way that they all play off of each other, and then they progress through a campaign that keeps your progress, keeps the experience of your units, and sort of allows you to fully develop their abilities. And so that's what makes it good. It's the combat and the way you use the units, the way the units are balanced from each other, and the way the AI also is able to use the units, because Panzer Corps had a pretty good AI system. Now, they're not trying to fix things which are not broken in the first place. And many aspects will remain unchanged. That's a kind of good thing, because of course it will establish some kind of continuity with the series and what everyone is expecting that it is going to be. At the same time, they're giving the player a number of new tactical options, which will make the playing experience more interesting and engaging. And here are some examples of these options. So most of the dev diary is going to be about describing what they're going to be doing differently with mechanics that usually are present in some war games, but in the particular format of Panzer Corps, they didn't used to be. So there's going to be an overrun mechanic. This is essentially when tanks get a free movement after they destroy an enemy unit. So it's a unique ability of tanks to run over crippled enemy units and destroy them in the process, so kind of an execute without spending their move or an attack action. So this is what a lot of war games do to kind of simulate how the mobile warfare of the Second World War really was about momentum in a way. And so you have tanks that can just kind of roll through a series of enemy units. And you can see that a lot of these, we're going to see as we go through, a lot of these are very, very much focused on tactical abilities of different units. So they're really focusing heavily on that aspect of the gameplay. Like, they have some things for supply. Like they say, they have encirclements. So they say that Panzer Corps is a war game, and for most players, war is the most interesting aspect of all. On the other hand, moving around non-combat supply units, counting supply points is much less fun. So that's why they're kind of having that take a backseat. So there's not going to be a full-blown realistic model of supply a la one of the more complex war games, such as, for example, Gary Grisby's War in the East or something like that. However, we felt that cutting enemy units off from supply was an interesting and useful tactical option, so we included it in the game. Now, that was a thing in Panzer Corps 1. If you could surround an enemy unit, you would... you would have of course, combat bonus against it, and you would also get a bigger reward for killing it in terms of you'd get some money for killing it, which normally wouldn't be the case, kind of representing how you're capturing enemy units. But that wasn't anything that would actually impact the combat. So what you have is now that there is when a group of units being encircled by the enemy, only passable terrain needs to be blocked, so like, of course, sea tiles don't count. It no longer receives any supply, and on top of this, encircled units will get a progressive combat penalty every turn, so now the player has a choice: tackle the next objective head-on, or try to encircle it and weaken the defenders before dealing with them. So this is, of course, again, about how you approach a scenario and how you conduct this war of movement. That was one of the things that Panzer Corps really did well, was just get the impression of how the war of movement was playing out. And for that reason, like, I think that most of the scenarios that people enjoyed were like the early war ones, so Poland, Norway, France, those kinds of scenarios. But that was just me. Actually don't know many other people who played Panzer Corps, so yeah, I actually do not know. So you can see that they included a nice little picture where an infantry unit is surrounded on the peninsula and it's not getting any supplies. You can see that they're not getting any supplies if we zoom in by their, I'm not sure if you can see this, but their kind of shell icon over there. They've got two icons. They've got a movement arrow beneath their 10 kind of marker. That 10 is their hit points. And you can see that their supply marker is kind of grayed out, whereas the red units on the bottom that are doing the encircling, their sort of shell icon is lit up. So that tells you that that unit is fully supplied with ammunition. Now, of course, since this is an infantry unit, it can still move while being encircled. And you can see that they have added in the hexes a nice little dotted line to kind of mark the area of the pocket that is actually encircled. So what that kind of does is give you kind of an idea of where the encirclement is. Now this is something that's kind of different from what Panzer Corps used to be, because Panzer Corps used to be, of course, hex-based, but it didn't really have hex control, you could say. They didn't really have hex control in the way that we see over here. This is actually kind of a feature that they might have taken from another series of war games called Order of Battle, which kind of includes this kind of supply system, this kind of hex control system. And that's a very good series. I recommend that you play it. And yeah, so that's essentially that. By the way, now that we're here, we can actually take a look at how beautiful this map looks. Now, an article on Wargamer, which is a site that kind of does articles about war games, like the name says, they say that a lot of these maps are actually going to be procedurally generated in terms of the terrain, with only kind of the basic layouts taking into account the historical aspect of any given campaign, any given geography. And that's kind of interesting in my opinion. Now, I haven't actually been able to find any information from the developer Slitherine as to this, but I'm going to trust Wargame on this one. And it's kind of interesting because it's going to add a lot of replayability with how you can approach a different scenario. So, for example, you can see right now that these, looks like British from the flag, units have surrounded an enemy on a peninsula. Perhaps the next time there's going to be different elements of the next time you play the same scenario. There's going to be different elements of terrain that make this kind of strategy more difficult to execute, and then you're going to have to do something else. Perhaps you're going to have to push in another kind of way, and I kind of like that, you know, because a lot of these war games do not really have that much replayability because they're just based on kind of entirely historical scenarios where you have maps that are modeled pretty much only on existing geography. Now, some games actually do that better than others, but you know that does detract, of course, from the way you can play different things. Again, like, you know, any amount of given scenarios that are going to be the same every time do not really change, you know? So this is good. And of course the map looks very, very good, and that's important. And they're using the Unreal Engine 4, by the way, to power this game, because if you look at the Panzer Corps 1 over here, it is very clear sometimes as to what kind of terrain your units are going to be fighting in. For example, if we zoom in, oh, that's not a very good zoom, but to the southwest corner of the map, you can see that there's a lot of bocage there, and it's kind of understandable. And then it's kind of understandable that in the coastline it's plains, but for example, I do not have a screenshot here where there's any hills, but it used to be pretty difficult actually to distinguish certain features of terrain from other ones in the first Panzer Corps. The UI also in the first Panzer Corps was not that clear, whereas if you can see that in the second one, the UI has been cleaned up very, very greatly. So they're trying to improve the usability and the user-friendliness of the game quite a lot, which is very much appreciated because that's something that a lot of these war games actually lack. They feel clunky, they feel unresponsive, and I hope that this is going to be different in this one. It looks like they're taking a lot of cues from Civ in a way on this one, because the map is kind of seamlessly blending in to show as if it's kind of a real place without just being too hexy, which is fine. While at the same time you can turn the hex grid on and you can see essentially what the interactions are going to be between different hexes, and also the terrain types are very clearly distinguished from each other, and they I think took pretty good care to have a screenshot where you could see all the different terrain features in one. So for example, you see that there's the plains near the river, there's a rail network and a road network connecting these two port tiles. So you can see that there is also the port or urban tile that's very, very easy to distinguish. There's the airport that's easy to distinguish. And then in this part of the map, you can see that there's forest that's very, very clear, and it's also got a color difference, so you have kind of color coding. And then you have hills on one side, and then mountains clearly distinguishable from the hills, and the hills clearly distinguishable from the plains. I hope that that's going to be staying the same way. Now, of course, the map is going to be procedurally generated, so you might have some issues with that. I just hope that it's going to be, you know, it's going to be like in these screenshots, of course, you know, alpha versions, screenshots, all that. So if we go ahead and continue on down, another feature that they're adding is splitting units. So, you know, if you want to like spread out your guys and capture more territory at the price of combat effectiveness, so just giving you more options. Captured units. So captured units in Panzer Corps campaigns were so popular that we've decided to make them a core part of the game mechanics. So the way Panzer Corps 1 worked was that you had a kind of progressive system where you're the commander of a unit that's fighting through all the different campaigns. So of course it was very, the most famous one was the German one, where you just fought through all the different conquests of the German Reich in the early game years, and then you fight on to Barbarossa, and that's like the, you know, then you have the big climax. And the way it worked was that you had a lot of branching different scenarios depending on how well you you performed, how much score you were able to accrue, and especially, of course, the main like category was whether you had a I forget how exactly they were called, but like a decisive victory, a perfect victory, or just a Pyrrhic victory or normal victory, or you were defeated. So of course, if you were defeated, the campaign was over, or you had in some of the early missions just kind of a second chance scenario to redeem yourself, kind of representing how either you're kind of messing up the whole war, or your officer has been demoted. Or if you got a great victory, you got to skip some scenarios, you know. Whereas if you just got normal victories, you had progressively more difficult scenarios as the game went on. And your units, where you had essentially persistent units and you had scenario-based units. And persistent units stayed with you, as the campaign went on. So they seem like they're gonna be keeping this system, and so when you force an enemy unit to surrender, its equipment is captured and added to a pool. That's very good. Later, you can use this pool to create new units or replace existing ones for free. So, for example, if you're going to be capturing these two guys because they're encircled, maybe you get to keep whatever unique kind of equipment they had. Although, I mean, these look like pretty standard infantry units, so maybe it's just, maybe it's just rifles. Maybe you can just use them to replenish your losses of other infantry units for, lesser price, because, of course, you're not getting the actual men. But if you're capturing a tank, you can get a tank unit that's not of your country, so you have more variety of different units. So, for example, if you're playing Barbarossa, you can capture a T-34, and then later on, once you've learned how to use it, I guess, you can use that T-34 to fight in your own force. This adds yet another tactical consideration. Shall I destroy this unit or try to make it surrender instead? So that's, kind of playing into that encirclement mechanic again. So, will I just try to overrun it and get to my objectives as quickly as possible so that I can, complete them faster and get a bigger reward, or should I surround it and try to take it for myself? Unique hero abilities. So unlike in Panzer Corps, where heroes only gave stat boosts to units, kind of like the aces in Hearts of Iron 4, if you know how that works, you just had heroes that were assigned kind of like officers to a unit, and they gave some kind of boosts. In Panzer Corps 2, they will have many unique tactical abilities, and some of these abilities will be synergistic. So using your heroes in the best way possible will be a different task in every playthrough. So this looks like they're kind of trying to differentiate the kind of options that you're going to get. Hopefully they're not going to go too, like, kind of quote-unquote arcadey with this approach. Like, I don't know, giving free supply to units or something like that, It's just kind of like... they should keep it within the realm of what the game already is, and just not go too balls to the walls with it. But hey, you could have different options with that, and that's good. More options is more good. Air and naval warfare. So of course, major changes will happen in air and naval warfare. So the ground combat was the most developed of Panzer Corps. The ship combat was not very good. It was just kind of like, bigger ship beats smaller ship, basically. And the air combat, it was, like, useful in a way. It was conducive to the ground combat being interesting. So, for example, what you had is Panzer Corps, of course, is very much focused on kind of that war of movement feel. And in the German army kind of doctrine, what they wanted to do with their close air support and bomber aircraft was that they wanted to have them as flying artillery to support the panzer formations, to support the rapidly moving infantry and that kind of stuff. And that's what the air combat in Panzer Corps kind of did well. So the air combat in function of the ground combat. So, air-to-air combat wasn't that interesting, but then... once you've cleared out the enemy air force, is how you're going to be using your different kinds of bomber aircraft to support your infantry, to support your tanks. How you're going to use your close air support to kind of turn away enemy tanks and destroy enemy anti-tank guns, so that your tanks can kind of have a clearer path to enemy objectives to break through. And then how you're going to use your heavier bombers to kind of level heavier fortifications and the likes. That was a more interesting part of the air combat, and they're saying that they're keeping that, but they're adding upon it. So with so many different roles, unit classes, and terrain types, the ground war was a varied and rich gameplay experience, and it was. We felt that the air and naval combat was somewhat lacking in comparison, and it was. Our ultimate goal in the sequel is to make them interesting enough to allow dedicated naval-only and air-only scenarios. And to achieve this goal, we are looking at various naval-only and air-only hex-based war games for inspiration. So what they're kind of trying to do, I guess, is to try to make possible something like, I don't know, air bombing campaign over Germany, kind of mini campaign, or Battle of the Atlantic mini campaign, something like that. So the most interesting or important change in the air war is that all aircraft act from airfields now and return to their base automatically at the beginning of their turn. So that's why you see these airfields. Now again, this is a feature that's taken partly from other war games. I have in mind the Order of Battle series again, where you have airfields. But in there, it was actually kind of different because the airfields themselves, the planes did not return to them each turn. They returned to them after a few turns when their fuel kind of gauge was running out. And that was kind of weird because, you know, it's supposed to be like this plane is flying for days upon end, you know, for weeks. And it wasn't, you know, that wasn't that kind of responsive and realistic, kind of, if you may. Like, it was conducive to gameplay, but I don't know. It was just kind of arcadey in a way. In here, however, the airfields are going to be an interesting point to hold and very important tactical kind of tile because, of course, aircraft have ranges. And so since the planes return to their airfield every day, planes are going to have a limited range. So you're going to have more... I guess, incentive to go after certain areas of the map because maybe they hold a key airfield that the enemy aircraft are going to be using to bomb you, and then if you take it, you can use it to bomb them, obviously. And that was, of course, very important in the actual real war. So just as in real life, the effectiveness of aircraft drops as the distance to their base increases, again, just so that it's more important to manage what aircraft you have and what airfields you go after and capture. This means that all air rules and mechanics from Panzer Corps, like mass attack and interceptors, will remain in place, but at the same time, the airfields, their location on the map, timely capture, and proper defense become key elements in air warfare. So the mass attack and interceptors is basically like the way fighters acted was that if you had different, like a lot of different fighters kind of bunched up into one single area, they dealt more damage. And if an enemy fighter was trying to break through a fighter of yours, or, you know, trying to move, or a bomber aircraft too, was trying to move within kind of a zone of control over your fighter would get a kind of free attack. So kind of an attack of opportunity mechanic. As for naval war, naval terrain is, by definition, less interesting than ground terrain with endless sea hexes in all directions. To compensate for this, ships themselves will be more complex entities with various factors like orientation and position of turrets, affecting combat effectiveness, and a damage model inspired by Pacific General, which I have not played, so I do not know, but I can get a few guesses as to what it is, going beyond the simple strength number under the ship. So the strength number is, of course, this kind of indicator beneath that. This is kind of interesting because, well, in a way, actually sea combat terrain is not that uninteresting if you kind of research how it worked. So, like, of course, industrialized nations pumping out modern warships do not have this problem as much as in antiquity, because of course our ships are more advanced now. But the way sea kind of tides and sea levels and the kind of inland seas that you can have work to disrupt or to allow different types of movement in naval warfare is actually very interesting, but we're not going to go into that. They decided to not model it because it would be very complicated, and I am totally fine with that. However, what they're going to do is, again, they're trying to make the units themselves more interesting, and that's, I think, a very good move because you have so many different kinds of warships that were being used in World War II and so many different roles that you could replicate in a smaller way, but in a kind of maybe less developed scale, but still you could develop pretty well a kind of, I guess you could say, ship tactical system. Much like in the land warfare, where you have different ships reacting differently to each other. So, for example, maybe Your destroyers are going to have different kinds of torpedo attacks. But, of course, their guns are a lot less important, or a lot less useful. Or you could have that, you know, your destroyers have more chances of dodging enemy shells. You know, you could have so many different things that could happen. And also, with the turrets thing, it's kind of interesting how they're going to be doing that. Like the orientation and the position of turrets. So I guess they're going to be trying to pay more attention to positioning and try to make, in a way, flanking, I guess, more important. So I guess that's kind of fine. I wonder if they're going to be modeling in different effectiveness of anti-aircraft. I don't know. Whatever. I have no idea. So carrier and submarine classes will be much better fleshed out to represent their unique roles in naval war. A more advanced naval model will allow this series to branch out into any theater of war in the future, including the naval heavy Pacific, something which Panzer Corps never did. So they're talking about the DLCs, I'm guessing, which they said they're going to be taking they're going to be taking notes from Paradox, which is kind of like, it can be very good or very bad, but we're going to see. So that's the end of the dev diary. Oh, by the way, of course, like the naval damage model, let's talk about that for a little bit. So the damage model inspired by Pacific generals, I probably should have done some research into what that is, but going beyond a simple strength number on their ship, I'm guessing that the ships are going to have different modules that can be damaged. So, for example, aft and forward turrets, or engines, or rudder, and that kind of stuff. And so the different kinds of damage that can be applied are going to be, of course, affecting your ship's ability to fight in different ways. So if your forward turrets are knocked out, your ship can't fire in the forward hexes, but it can fire in the back hexes, so you're going to be trying to kite away. If your rudder is damaged, you're going to be Bismarcking, you're going to be just rolling over in one direction, just kind of turning in one direction and making this kind of turn over and over. You know, if you played the World of Warships, you kind of know what I'm talking about. And, yeah, it's going to be that way. Or if you're, I don't know, if you're different kinds of, perhaps if your commander is knocked out, you cannot use certain abilities that the ship might have, and you cannot use, I guess maybe your accuracy will be reduced or something like that. You know, that kind of damage model. And so that's going to be forcing you to kind of react to the situation more than simply, oh, look, my ship is damaged, let's take it out of the line and send it back so that it's saved for the next mission or something. I don't know. So that's the end of that, and I will be continuing to kind of follow the progress and the development of Panzer Corps 2. Let's actually kind of look at the bigger screenshot. I'm going to just guess as to what some of these things are. So this kind of looks like a more later war scenario. So, of course, there's like a Panther model and a Panzer II model. One thing that's kind of interesting is that you could see in the screenshot that all of the infantry units, as opposed to all of the kind of non-infantry support, in this case kind of an artillery piece, and the tanks, the artillery and the tanks have 10 hit points, whereas the infantry seem to have 15 hit points by default, which is kind of nice because it kind of reinforces their role as something different. You can see that the map clearly marks the line of sight of your units, so that's a very, very good thing because, for example, here, I have no idea what my units can see. You know, of course, if you like play the game, if you know the mechanics, you know exactly kind of the vision mechanics, how they work. So you, of course, an experienced player does not have that problem as much as a new player, but on just kind of on a glance, I have no idea what my units can see. Whereas, you know, in a kind of real environment, I would have that chance, and that's something that always kind of pisses me off about some of these war games, is that they don't really tell you what your units can see. And so perhaps if I had known what my unit could see, I would not have sent it in one way or another, and it would not have gotten ambushed. You know, it's going to make it easier for you to determine exactly where you need to be more careful and conduct further recon before advancing there, and where you can be more bold and brazen. You can see that it's clearly marking the line of sight. It's clearly marking also which kind of objective hexes you control in blue, and which objective hexes the enemy controls. So that's kind of nice. And in the top, you can see that there's a lot of different, like, kind of resource bars, I guess. There's a mini-map in the bottom right, just like in the first Panzer Corps. And actually, in some ways, I think that the first Panzer Corps map is kind of superior to the second Panzer Corps map, but, you know, alpha subject to change, all that. But the UI overall, as you can see, has been greatly improved because, like, for example, over here, I have no idea what any of this stuff does. And one problem with Panzer Corps was that the tooltips were sometimes not very helpful in explaining what something was. But it seems like they're gonna be kind of developing that. And in the top bar, you have certain resources. You have your turn timers. Resources looks like they have kind of a money resource, a kind of unit cap, it might be. I have no idea, actually. Supply, so ammunition. A prestige or experience thing. I'm guessing it's prestige. Now, it seems like they've split prestige and money. Prestige used to be money in Panzer Corps 1, but it looks like here it's kind of a different thing. It might be a kind of score meter, or it might be a kind of mana for your special abilities. I don't know. And then you have sea transport, air transport, and land transport, I'm guessing. So, of course, you know, it's going to be your capacity to transport different units through the rail network, through the road network, and through, well, I guess the road network is just going to be automatically used by units. But yeah, through the rail network, through one port to another, for example, over here, and from one airfield to another. So yeah, that's going to be that. And it looks like in the top left, they have a lot of ledgers. They have the units purchasing menu, so to buy reinforcements, and they have a kind of wiki, maybe. There's an I, probably stands for information, and then a stat ledger, which, you know, stat tables for units, very useful. So yeah, that's kind of my impression. There's a lot of things that can go very, very well with this game, and I'm going to be definitely following the development. So I want to thank you all for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed, and I will see you soon.